how much carbohydrates can you dispose of in a meal? And I would argue, and I'm going to tell you the numbers, it's around 40 grams if you are sedentary. The average American eats 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. Gain weight, right? Completely distorts metabolism because muscle cannot balance the carbs that we are ingesting. And by the way, the utilization of carbohydrates is, again, a non-exercising person, 4 grams an hour go to the brain, 2 grams an hour go to organs, and 2 to 3 grams skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle doesn't use a lot of carbs at rest if it's healthy. Some goes to glycogen, but if you are not training, your glycogen stores are full.
I kind of want to pause there. There's already a lot to talk about. And Jay, I'm wondering, when you pulled this clip, and I know you watched it several times like we all did, I'm wondering, what were your first reactions just getting to this halfway point?
Yeah, so, there's a few things that come to mind. This was actually sent in by a listener as well. They posted it in a comment, which was a good one because otherwise I would not have found this. And obviously there's a lot to, I think, dispel here and discuss because I think, especially as we get through to the end and some of her specific recommendations, I think this is really harmful advice. We heard it earlier, the idea that, if you're sedentary, you can't dispose of more than 40 grams of carbs in a meal. So, I think there's, even just starting there, using the word dispose, I think is just terrible. We're talking about a nutrient here in carbohydrates, and it's something that's utilized. We use it for, producing energy. It's a fuel source. We do store it as glycogen. There's various other kind of structural components that are made up of carbohydrates. It's not something that is a waste product that you dispose of. It's something that our bodies use and need. And if we don't get enough of, our bodies will go to really great lengths to produce them. So this idea of disposing of carbs, I think, is already just a really harmful sentiment and not the right question that we want to be asking, as far as like, what is the amount that we can eat in a meal without causing problems? I think rather the question is, what is the amount that we can eat that best supports our health? And to get to this idea of 40 grams, obviously with a presentation like this, there's no, sometimes they'll use slides and they'll have some citation or something, but I have never seen anything in the literature to suggest anything like that. I don't know where she's coming up with that. And obviously we can't comment too much on that side because this isn't a type of content where she's going to be providing, and digging into the kind of science there. But I would say there's absolutely nothing that would support that. The amount of carbs we're going to be able to utilize in a meal, we utilize all the carbs. The question is, where do they go? And that's going to depend on so many factors. When was the last meal that we ate and what was it composed of? How many carbs were in there? How quick is the meal that we're currently eating digesting? Are we having, a glass of juice, or are we having a balanced meal with some protein, fat, and carbs? And so how slowly are we going to be taking up those carbs? What was the last time we were, moving or exercising? How much sleep did we get? There's tons of factors that will determine whether the carbs are going to be used immediately for energy or stored as glycogen or converted to glucose or lactate if we're talking, fructose consumption, or be used to, convert to anything else that carbs get converted to. But of course, the main things are going to be energy and storage. So there's a lot of factors there. To give any concrete number, I think is just a huge leap. And then, she threw out some of those numbers as far as what the body might use in an hour, as far as the brain and internal organs and muscles. And we can come back to this later, but just from the numbers she gave, it was 4 grams for the brain, 2 grams for the organs, and 2 to 3 grams for skeletal muscle, which sounds like it's not that much. But when you add those up, and let's assume 3 grams per hour for skeletal muscle, we're at 9 grams an hour. Over 24 hours, that's 215 grams of carbs. And so if you're thinking you're eating 3 meals a day, that's over 70 grams of carbs for each meal. So just based on the numbers that she's shared so far for a sedentary individual, I don't know how she's getting to 40 grams a day when the actual numbers she shared would suggest 70 grams a meal and 40 grams a meal, just for baseline function, not even considering if you're doing anything beyond that. And then there's also the problem here of this idea that the only thing that changes your carb needs are whether or not you're sedentary, but we can come back to that because she talks a lot about muscle and activity later.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, jump in. What were you thinking? I know we were all smiling watching this together.
I mean, when I look at this, like there's even studies using tracers. So you have tagged carbohydrates where you see that in non-exercising individuals who have metabolic dysfunction, even if you just look at fructose, they can dispose 36 grams, dispose in quotations, meaning oxidize that 36 grams in a meal. And then if it's glucose and fructose, it goes up to 52. And that doesn't even account for the fact that the carbohydrate can be turned into lactate, glycogen, glycerol, and lipids. So it's like, what, number one, like dispose of is an arbitrary term. Like she needs to define it here. It basically means nothing, because the thing is like you can dispose of carbohydrate in multiple different ways. And we know from the research from like tagging carbohydrates that people ingest, radio labeling them, we can see where they go in the body. We can see that they can be disposed of, again, in quotations. So for me, it's like, it's blatantly false. Like there's not, like what she's saying, I don't even know where she's getting the number from. And we have studies showing that people can actually take more than 40 grams of carbohydrate in a meal and turn it into a variety of different things, oxidize it to energy, etc. So I don't know where she's getting these numbers, like how you create the presentation. I would like to see a citation so I could follow up on the information, but without the citation, just looking at his face, I'm not really seeing much here that I'm like, yeah, this is valuable information.
I think she knew we needed a clip to comment on, so provided some great raw material. But yeah, my first thought is just how harmful it is for people who are really confused, because I get asked all the time, like, how much should I eat? How often? Every 3 hours? Every 4.5 hours? Should I be trying to make it every 6 hours? What should my plate look like? So when a so-called expert makes such a confident claim, I can see people feeling more confused, but also desperate enough to maybe try and make that work for them. And like you were both saying, it kind of leaves the rest of the day, the rest of the caloric needs in this chaotic state where people might be throwing themselves off and actually entering into more metabolic dysfunction because they're trying to meet this arbitrary claim. So let's finish the clip and see what else we can talk about.
We have to balance our fuel system with a diet that is reasonable and amplified for skeletal muscle health. Here's how you do it. The current RDA is set at 130 grams of carbohydrates a day. I showed you that nobody's eating fruits and vegetables. Carry on. Avoid French fries. Any carbohydrate, and the obligatory use is about 80 grams per day. I don't want to throw a wrench into this, but I'll be outside afterwards. The body can generate glucose through gluconeogenesis. You don't have to eat carbohydrates. If you're going to eat carbs, earn it. So if you're eating 225 grams of carbohydrates, how long do you have to exercise to burn that? I don't know many people, maybe David is, other than David right in the front, he's from SWAT team in San Francisco, doing 2 hours of exercise a day, 3 hours of exercise to manage carbohydrates. We're not doing it. So if you care about your metabolic health, then you have to mitigate carbs if you're not training.
Okay. Jay, I know you have some comments just with that alone. What was coming up for you there?
Oh man. Where to start? I mean, it's so hard not to comment on the we mentioned this in the last time we were talking about our clips, how someone can say so much and yet say so little. And the kind of word choice here, I mean, the few words that actually have meaning and connotation tend to be, again, like we were talking about earlier, the idea of disposing of carbs or mitigating carb intake. But then we have lines thrown in about, a diet that's reasonable and amplified for muscular health or whatever it was. I mean, it's just words, just like meaningless words. But in any case, to actually talk about maybe some of the concrete things she said. So she mentioned obligatory use is 80 grams a day, when earlier she pointed out minimum use for a sedentary person of brain, organs, and skeletal muscle that not only is not just 80 grams a day, but was 2.5 times that amount. And that was the amount she cited earlier of basically around 200 grams a day of obligatory carb utilization by the body. She then throws in this novel idea that I'm sure no one else has ever heard of called gluconeogenesis, where your body can use other substrate, specifically normally amino acids, and convert that into glucose. It's kind of like the novel idea she shared with us last time about how someone should eat a gram of protein per pound of body weight. Again, brand new concepts here. But, we've talked so many times about the cost of doing so, right? If you're not getting those carbohydrates from your diet, if you're not going to get that at least, let's call it 200 grams, but that's again a bare minimum, when we're talking across averages and things like that, if you're not getting that from your diet and you do have to get it or derive it from protein that's coming in, for one, you have to make sure there's enough protein coming in, because if not, you have to break down your own lean tissue to provide those amino acids. And then secondarily, it's a really inefficient and therefore disfavored process internally. And for that reason, it requires stress hormones in order to induce that conversion of amino acids into glucose. And that requires, again, stress hormones like glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol. And when we do that, we are also signaling to our bodies that there's a lack of abundant carbohydrate available, a lack of good food available. And so in the process of doing that, those stress hormones also signal to reduce thyroid hormone production and conversion, and lower reproductive hormone production, and turn down our metabolic rate, which has a major cost in the long term. So just because you can produce those carbohydrates endogenously without consuming them doesn't mean there's not a cost to doing so. So those are kind of the main points here. But then I just wanted to highlight again that one at the end, she was talking about, the guy on the SWAT team he's exercising 2 hours a day, which you have to do if you're going to eat 225 grams of carbs per day. Yet, again, the minimum recommendation she mentioned earlier, just basal carbohydrate use, was between 190 and 215 grams of carbs. So if you exercise a little bit, and it doesn't mean exercise, if you just move a little bit, if you walk a little bit, that's going to increase the amount of carbs you use beyond that. And you don't need to be exercising like you're on a SWAT team to burn off the basal amount of carbohydrates that your body uses in a day. And again, you were talking about this, Theresa, the kind of fear that instills is terrible. Whether you're going to have the 40 gram a day mark or 225 grams or the 80 grams she mentioned, I mean, she's just throwing out all these numbers that are creating a lot of fear around carb intake and are totally unfounded, and instead are actually going to be causing negative effects. So those are the points that I took the most issue with. We know that avoiding carbohydrates is not the answer, but that doesn't mean that we just want to consume any carbohydrate-containing foods. And that's why I've created the Energy Balance Food Guide to help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The Energy Balance Food Guide is a one-page infographic that organizes foods on a spectrum based on how effectively they support your metabolism, and it also has a separate spectrum that adjusts this scale for you in the case that you're dealing with various digestive symptoms. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health, so head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.
Mike, what about you?
I know her brand is this whole muscle-centered health or like muscle medicine, or I don't know what the specific tagline is. I forget what it is, but it's like the idea that we need to set up a diet specifically for our muscle tissue is just kind of weird. It's like we need to set up a diet for our overall general health, including muscle tissue, bone tissue, brain tissue, hormonal systems, etc. So it's like almost myopic, and that leads me to believe that the rest of our thought processes are coming from like, well, how much energy does the muscles need, and how much, like, even the way she frames, like, well, our muscles only use X amount of glycogen, and if you're sedentary, you're not going to completely refill it, which completely kind of neglects the fact that our liver stores glycogen for other tissues in our body, especially our central nervous system, which brings us to the whole gluconeogenesis and the lower carbohydrate intake. It's known that the lower carbohydrate intake has negative impact on the thyroid system. And on top of that, if you go low carbohydrate, high protein intake, then you have a negative impact on the stress systems where you bump up cortisol to help clear all the ammonia that you get from turning that protein into carbohydrate. Because again, if you don't have adequate carbohydrate and you have an excess of protein, you're going to make that carbohydrate, because the carbohydrate is so essential that you will sacrifice other substrates and tissues to provide this carbohydrate. So you will upregulate gluconeogenesis. Now, there's a couple problems with this, and especially from her paradigm as somebody who's muscle-centric. But the first thing, before we even get to that, is that glucagon and driving gluconeogenesis, which Jay and I have done podcasts on together, like discussing this in depth, but essentially driving gluconeogenesis and higher levels of glucagon are directly associated with diabetes and driving the diabetic process, such that they see people who have higher fasting glucagon levels have an inability to suppress glucagon, have a higher risk of insulin resistance and diabetes overall. So glucagon, people say, oh, it's not a stress hormone. It's like, yes, it 100% is. And driving higher levels of it is problematic. So yes, can you use gluconeogenesis to produce your glucose? Sure. The question is not, can you do it, but is that optimal for your health? And it's like, clearly not. Like, it is not optimal for your health. This is why you see people like Dr. Sean Baker, who has a hemoglobin A1C of 6.1 or 6.3%, which is in the diabetic territory. And on top of that, his fasting blood glucose in the morning is in like 120s, 130s. And it's like, that's through gluconeogenesis. He's eating below the obligatory carbohydrate requirement while exercising and getting enough protein. And you see the aberrations in the metabolic profile with that. Again, this is not a character assassination on Sean or anything like this, but he's a prominent figure who is running his regimen similar, if not like more extreme than what she recommends. And we're seeing the outcomes of this. Now, the next thing that's interesting here is like, it's weird to say I'm like muscle centric and then want to promote the idea of gluconeogenesis, because the major substrate for gluconeogenesis are the amino acids that come from the muscle tissue, including alanine and glutamine. And yes, fats, the glycerol backbones, can go to gluconeogenesis, but the biggest providers are amino acids overall. So it's like you're going to break down proteins to make the carbohydrate. And if you don't eat enough protein, there's only one place that it's going to come from, and it's going to be your own tissues, which is largely going to be your muscle stores. So it's just weird to have this perspective of like, we need to set up this diet that is optimal for our muscle health and like get our muscles to the best metabolic state possible, but then have this dynamic where we're going to set up a diet where we potentially like degrade some of the muscle tissue to some extent by having lower carbohydrate, higher protein intake, and then trying to run on gluconeogenesis. So, I think we'd be happy to meet her outside and have a conversation about it. It's almost like, but you can meet me out back. That type of thing is like a little strong, but I think it's just a weird paradigm that it's like almost like oxymoronish. Like they don't mix together. Like they're kind of like at odds with each other. The frameworks, like these two competing things are existing within the same model, which doesn't really make that much sense. And so what I want to wrap up here with on this clip, to help dispel the confusion for people that you guys are talking about with the macro requirements, macro calorie requirements, whatever the deal is. The first thing is, from my perspective at least, and you guys stand separately, so I will just speak for myself here. But the first thing is, figure out what your energy needs are so you get a rough idea of what you need to eat. Then figure out your protein needs. So the 0.82 grams per pound I cited before. From there, the minimum requirements for carbohydrate that I would argue for, and Jay and I have argued for this together, the absolute bare minimum is the amount required for the brain tissue function. And then even you can probably add on top of that if you have any activity level at all, because you have other tissue where will require the carbohydrate. So it's going to be 150 grams per day for carbs. Now that's going to scale upwards based on a variety of factors, but that is the bare minimum that I'm ever really shooting for people. And that's based on those brain requirements, that 5.6 milligrams of glucose per minute per 100 grams of brain tissue. And then from there, the minimum fat intake that we want to shoot for, because you don't want to go too low fat. And I see this in the bioenergetic sphere now, is people saying, oh, I'm just going to go really low in fat because Randall cycle. And it's like too low fat causes problems as well. So like even from the research, I would say it's clear that going lower than 20% over the long term causes problems with hormones, causes problems with blood sugar, digestion, and absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. So 20% minimum. After that, you have your protein situated, you have a general idea of your energy intake. Then you adjust your carb and your fat intake upwards to hit your energy requirement and figure out what works for you. Like, where do you feel best? What works best for your body? Like for me, I've titrated my fat and my carb intake so that I find like around 400 grams of carbs with where I'm at with exercise, stuff like that. That's great. If after that, it's hard to hit the target. Like then I really have to try to eat more and more carb. And I just like, I can't, like I just, that much food just becomes too much with the carbohydrate, especially if I'm trying to do it from whole fruits and juices and things like this. And then for the fat target, I find about 100 grams per day for me. And I titrated up. It was like I did 80 grams for some time. I did 90. I tried 70. I kind of played around to find that target for myself. And I found about 100 grams allows me to sleep well, allows me to last between meals, maintains my hormonal function, digestion, etc. So you're going to have some play as an individual as what's going to work best for you. And then for me, that's how I kind of dispel this dietary dogma. It's like we actually set some targets on reasonable guidelines because we know there's problems with gluconeogenesis and we know there's problems with having the carbohydrate too low, but we also know there's problems with having the fat too low and also for some people having maybe the carbs too high and then crowding out room for fat and protein and things like this. So there's going to be some play, but figure out your intake, figure out your protein requirements, and then adjust the carbs and the fat, with the lowest being 150 grams per day for carbs, at least from my perspective. And then the lowest 20% of your caloric intake coming from fats. And then you can go up from there and trying to figure out what works for you. Because there's gonna be individuality here, right? Like all of our Jay and I's macro breakdown is going to be different, even though we're relatively similar sizes. Obviously, Theresa, your intake is going to be very different from ours because you're a woman.
Double.
You have, twice. Your metabolism's level 10. She's twice as much as us. But all of these factors will change those things, and that's why it's really about figuring out for you as an individual what works out with your context and adjusting based on some general lines in the sand, so you can see what's the next step is. And not have like kind of ridiculous, because like we just know now from Dr. Lyons, okay, 40 grams of carbs per meal and that's it. And it's like, but then it's conflicting with the other values she added. So I wanted to give some like general idea on how at least I'm setting things up. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, I like the idea, or I love the idea of having a general understanding of what works for you and also keeping some space for the intuition to maybe nudge you in different directions. Because I think, thinking of clients that have a history of disordered eating and maybe they're swallowed by living their life based on their watch and their chronometer. And they kind of lose that connection of cravings and even what sounds good to eat. And I think when we bring it back more to this conversation we can have with our body and start to think, well, what is my body asking for? I know I need to hit this certain target, but could it be that my body might be begging or requiring more carbohydrates today because I didn't realize that I was, very focused and had a great conversation and might need to replenish in that realm instead of following, I'd say, too rigid of a framework. And Mike, I'm not saying your approach is rigid at all. I do think so many people benefit from just having an understanding. Am I eating enough? Or, whoa, am I going way over in certain categories? And then bringing their own self-awareness and that ability to listen to what their body is telling them throughout the day, throughout different seasons, and, understanding that they're allowed to bend things a little bit, based on what the feedback is from their body. And again, if they're following blindly these claims, they might start developing sleep issues, or maybe they feel really awesome at first when their body is flooded with stress hormones and they're feeling, kind of Hulk-like. They're feeling energized. They're feeling amazing. It's reinforcing this idea that they're maybe doing something right. Then a couple months pass and, they can't poop. They can't sleep. They're crabby. They're irritable. They can't think clearly. Then we can start to maybe, maybe this is the perfect time for them to listen to a podcast like this, understanding that just because someone's making a claim and maybe they do feel awesome at first, if we think about what's going to be sustainable and what the body really needs to function optimally in all the realms, not just muscle in the short term, and then playing around with that based on what feedback you're getting. But yeah, Jay, I'm wondering, have you had any experience working with clients where they maybe come to you and they're following a really low carb diet and they're kind of confused why they feel so terrible? And how, if so, what's your approach from there? Like, how do you work with someone like that might be kind of stuck in the dogma of this is the way, this is what Dr. Gabrielle Lyon says to do?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question. And normally, as you were alluding to, people will start to see those symptoms creep in, right? Anxiety, trouble sleeping, energy starting to decrease, sometimes a lot of hunger and cravings, and low libido. And it just kind of starts to spiral, all the things that maybe had improved early on. But yeah, I mean, it's a matter of slowly doing the opposite of what she's suggesting here, which I think is something to come back to as well. Because Mike, you were talking minimums, and we almost get stuck in this conversation of minimums because that's how she's framing it. But that's not the question here. The question is optimal, right? And I'm not saying you were suggesting this, Mike. It's just like, if we're talking minimums, of course, here are the minimums, but we're never suggesting just get the minimum amount of carbs. But the reality is, being able to utilize, not dispose of, but utilize more carbs is so central to reversing these symptoms and improving our health, right? If we want to be able to sleep better, and we want to have more energy, and we want our brains to turn on, and we want our libido to increase, and all of the other things that come with those, we want better immune function and everything, utilizing carbs is central there. And so, slowly increase the amount of carbs we're consuming. And I think especially when we're making a big transition like that, doing it carefully, listening to our bodies, seeing what kind of symptoms come up. If we say, okay, maybe my optimum is 300 grams, 350, 400 grams a day, then we'll listen to our appetite and all that. We still don't want to jump to that. We want to increase slowly and test different foods and make sure that we're tolerating them effectively and that we're actually seeing the improvements that we're looking for, because there's a number of reasons why we actually might not utilize carbs well. And if that's the case, we do want to figure out what those are and work on reversing those. There were two other things, though, I wanted to come back to when it comes to a couple of the points Gabrielle Lyon made. And a point that you made too, Mike, which is if we're talking about a muscle-centric approach, like even if that did make sense as opposed to a general health-centric approach with which muscle health should be a natural byproduct. But if we were just focused on muscle, the gluconeogenic hormones are directly catabolic to the muscle. Like you were explaining that the amino acids, whether we're getting them from protein in our diet or protein in the muscle, we need those to produce glucose through gluconeogenesis. But in general, having more glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol is a way to degrade muscle. It's a way to lose muscle mass. It's the exact opposite of what you would want if you were taking a muscle-centric approach, unless by muscle-centric you mean trying to minimize it, which I'm assuming she doesn't. Or if you're using steroids to help prevent those catabolic effects, which again, I don't know if that's something she suggests or has done herself or anything like that, but that is also a totally different state of physiology where sure, a little bit of cortisol increase might not make that big of a difference because you're using, super physiological levels of some exogenous hormones. So yeah, I think that's a really important piece here. And the other, again, another claim that she mentioned a couple times in this clip, I believe, is that your glycogen stores are going to be full if you're not training. And this idea that you have to train to earn your carbs and exercise equals carb tolerance, even though she mentioned the basal levels with her calculations are about 200 grams a day, her basal needs. But it's worth noting that training is not the only thing that's going to deplete glycogen levels, right? Just existing is going to utilize glycogen from the liver, especially as you were saying that, Mike, that's where our brain and internal organs are getting their glucose from, and they use quite a bit. Not to mention your muscles will still be using some at rest. And if you're just generally active, you don't need to be training. You don't need to have this, specific weight training routine to be healthy. As long as you're generally active and moving, that will also utilize carbohydrates and also leave space in the glycogen stores, so to speak. But also not to mention, if you're metabolically healthy, those stores are malleable. So you can store way more glycogen in the liver if you ate extra carbs than you would normally. And that's been shown in the literature that the liver can store massive amounts of carbs if needed. So all of those things are malleable. Of course, the muscles can as well. But this idea that if you're eating carbs, you have to be weight training and you need to titrate those two things together, I think is, again, just such a harmful message. And not a new one either, right? I mean, I remember Charles Poliquin, that was his big tagline back, 15 years ago. Yeah, absolutely. And that he was one of the first people who had me on based on his advice at, 15 years ago, I was following a lower carb diet. So.
And it came from a well-intended place from your perspective, right? You wanted to be healthy. You wanted to, honor your metabolic health, and in following his rules, you ended up maybe taking a couple steps back. But thank goodness you're still here with us, Jay.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. And how unfortunate that the exact same message is still being purveyed by some of the top figures in the space.